All right. Why did it do that? All right. So, kind of where to begin on these next two sections is really determining what is the difference between learning and memory. And this we use these interchangeably. So you learn something when you can remember it. You change behavior based on information you have. And so in the general population, we kind of use learning and memory kind of interchangeably. But I want to give us for this class kind of a construct definition so that we specify what psychologists mean when we say you're learning something versus when you're remembering something. And so we'll kind of use this kind of start with up here with these two, this diagram up here. So learning, when we refer to learning, we're referring to a change in behavior. So we're saying that based on experience, based on things people learn about their environment, they either increase a behavior or they decrease a behavior. When we talk about memory, we talk about knowledge. It's about the information you know, okay? The reason why it's important to know the difference between learning and memory is because what you learn in school, for example, may not change your behavior at all. You may be in a certain context, behave the same way regardless of how much education or how much school you had. You might have seen some social media memes is don't judge intelligence by education. A person with a master's degree can be stupid as a person without one or something like that. And I kind of want to explain that because it's a very important concept. Okay. And I'll bring up in my early career, the area of study that I was very much interested in was intimate relationships. Because my first career coming out of college was working with victims of relationship violence, domestic violence, and sexual assault. And so I became really interested in the research literature on healthy, intimate relationships. And I studied that, gosh, 10, 15 years following the research, doing some on my own, all of those kinds of things. But, and you would think with all of that knowledge about healthy, intimate relationships, that my relationships would be quote unquote perfect. You would assume that based on the knowledge, right? But I make the same relationship mistakes as everyone else. I say the wrong things sometimes. I do the wrong things sometimes. Sometimes I do the right things. All of those kinds of things. My behavior necessarily hasn't changed, even though my knowledge about being in healthy relationships has. Okay. And that's why it's important to distinguish between learning and memory, because what we know does not always translate into changes in behavior. Okay. Now, I will tell you the kind of disadvantage of having that knowledge is once you do something stupid, you kind of go, oh, geez, you realize why you did it. So maybe that's a little bit of a advantage. Sometimes it's a disadvantage, but just so you know, knowledge does provide context for your behavior, but it doesn't necessarily change your behavior. Okay. So we're going to start with learning and what we've learned about learning about basic behaviors. And if you remember at the beginning of the class, we talked about these two gentlemen right here, John B. Watson and B.F. Skinner, who were kind of, if you remember, Watson was the father of behaviorism and B.F. Skinner was kind of the poster child. Okay. And what we learned from these individuals is they wanted psychology should study only those things of observable, right? Remember, they wanted psychology to be more like the natural sciences, okay? And so we should only observe those things that are observable. And so this became what's known as stimulus response science, meaning that the thing that we can, oh geez, the thing that, what the heck? Did that really do that? The things that we can actually observe, I'm sorry about that, are stimuluses in the environment. So a stimulus, we present an organism, and the response, the behavior, okay? The second thing that the behaviorists asserted is that you can observe animal behavior and translate that into human behavior. So we could train, for example, rats and pigeons and whatnot. And what we learn from the way they change their behaviors based on stimuluses such as punishment or reward, we can then translate that into human behavior. Okay. And that still is a popular way to explore behavior. And it kind of makes sense because if you think about it, while these individuals studied this idea of reward and punishment and all of these things, they're not the ones uh, that discovered it. We've been domesticating animals for centuries. Um, and so this idea of shaping behavior in animals and then assuming it translates into human behavior isn't something new. It's just something they asserted is possible in their studies. Okay. So we're going to kind of start down this travel line of where these ideas came from. And we're going to start a little bit before behaviorism with Thorndike because he wrote an interesting little book called Animal Intelligence. And this is where the argument that changes in animals' behaviors can be asserted to translate into human behavior. So he's the one that kind of gave the evidence for Watson and Skinner to say we can experiment on pigeons, and the same thing goes to humans. Okay. Now, I will tell you in modern animal behavior, and this is a ethical kind of issue, if you want to say, if you look at animal experimentation. Um, Back in when I was in my undergraduate years, I worked under a behaviorist psychologist who had a kind of an animal lab in the basement of the psych department at the time. And she had catalogs of different mice that you could purchase that had different changes in their biology. So you could uh, purchase a rat that had a tumor in their limbic system at a certain place. You could purchase a rat that had diabetes. You could purchase a rat that had muscular dystrophy. You basically, depended upon the research you wanted, can purchase a rat or a pigeon that has the different at abnormalities that you want to research. Okay. And this kind of idea that to do this kind of goes back to this Thorndike era of we can learn from animals and translate that into humans. Okay. So just kind of an interesting side note, there are catalogs out there like that. You can even purchase animals without limbs and whatnot. So, but anyways, let's start with Thorndike and kind of what he kind of learned. And remember, what we're talking about is we need to remember these guys did not care about your emotions, your feelings, your conscious awareness. In fact, B.F. Skinner is going to say your awareness of what you did is a byproduct of learning processes. So this is kind of a cold way to look at human behavior. and we will see how it falters and why we don't use pure behaviorism in a little while. But just kind of remember this as we go down this journey line, okay? So we're going to start with Thorndike, who was the first to show that animals could solve problems a lot like human beings, okay? And he used a kind of what I don't know why he used cats. If anyone has a cat, you know they're not the most easily trainable animals. I think maybe used cats because he thought they were most like humans. Maybe, I'm not sure. But what he did is he created what is known as a cat box. Okay. And he usually would starve the poor kitty or cat for a day or two. And then outside this cat box that you see here, he would set the cat's food. Okay. Now, in order for the cat to get out of the cat box, it had to solve some problem. So in this situation, you see the cat needs to pull down on this little rope tag thing that would lift this device and let the cat out. Okay. And what he recorded is the amount of time it took the cat to solve the problem. Okay. And as you can see, in excessive trials, it got less and less and less. Now, let me explain this line here. Is Thorndike might have used this setup for like the first 5 trials. But then maybe he made it so this blue tag was a button on a wall. So instead of pulling down on it, the cat had to push on it. Or let's say the cat had to do something else, such as um, uh, knock on the top of the cat box, and that would relieve the thing. So,
You ready? Sorry.
so based upon the task, the cat had to solve a different problem every 5 to 10 trials. Okay. But even though the mechanism changed in order for the cat to escape, the cat knew over time what it needed to do was open this box, this door. And all the kitty needed to do is figure out what device or what position it needed to be in order to open that box. And so this is kind of the results is over time, the kitty figured out quicker and quicker how to open this thing. Okay. And what Thorndike argued is that this is similar to human behavior, that a lot of times we may be faced with the same problem, but it may need a different solution each time. Okay, so for example, if we want to think about dinner, right? Last night we had chicken available, but tonight we don't have any chicken, but we have Brussels sprouts. So do we just not eat because we don't have chicken? No, we probably will just eat the Brussels sprouts, or maybe some of us will go without, right? So even though we're faced with the same problem, we can change our behavior based upon this what's available to us in the situation. And this became again the main argument that we could study animals and translate that into human behavior. Okay. So now this is more of a memory task, but it has been used to we'll see this kind of idea come up when we look at B.F. Skinner and his training of pigeons and reward and punishment. But Ebbinghaus was one of the first that tested memory. Okay. And what he did was use illogical synonyms. So he didn't use real words because he didn't want your past knowledge to influence your memory. So what he would do is he would have you memorize a list of nonsense words, words that have no meaning, and then he would see your how much you forget when you don't rehearse that list over and over. So Again, you learn the list and you get it 100% of the time. And then let's say 20 minutes, you're down to 60%. 1 hour, you're down to 50. And then if you see down here by day 7, your memory is around 10%. Okay, you remember about 10% of the original words you remember. And this is a way of recording, again, memory, which we will get to a little bit later. But what Ebbinghaus was showing is that we can measure behavior and we can measure what people see based on their stimulus and how they remember it. Okay. And again, B.F. Skinner is going to use this technique very similarly with animals because animals don't usually come and have to push on a button or peck a certain key or do something unfamiliar in order to get a reward or a punishment. Okay. And so he's going to use this similar procedure to test how we learn and how our behavior changes based on stimuluses that are presented. And then the last person that we should talk about before we get into Watson and Skinner, and we'll get into social learning and whatnot, is probably a person who Watson, especially if you remember I explained the little Albert experiments, probably gave the best proof of behaviorism. Okay. Trying to remember. Okay. And we will get into classical conditioning, which he came up with probably on Tuesday, if we don't have time today. But what Pavlov showed, I let me rewind for just a minute. Ivan Pavlov was a Russian scientist, of genius, if you want to think about it in his time, because I find it interesting that we talk about Ivan Pavlov in psychology classes because he was actually a physiologist. He was interested in the digestive system. Okay. And it's interesting that we're going to talk about Pavlov in as far as methods of learning when we should talk about him as one of the first to develop things like antacids, how long it takes to digest certain foods, food preferences, all of those kinds of digestive things are kind of ignored for this Pavlovian ring the bell, dog salivates type of thing. But he's going to come up with a concept known as classical conditioning. And he's going to do this mainly because he was doing an experiment on the salivation of dogs. And we're going to get to kind of what he found later, but what he discovered was something called associative learning. Okay. That there's things, uh, there are things that we learn that we don't necessarily need to experience to learn. Okay. So, for example, when you walk in the kitchen, you probably might get hunger pains. When you walk in your bedroom, you might get tired. When you get to the dentist's office, you might feel your teeth be a little bit sensitive. Okay. These things are what known as associative learning, that given an environmental situation, what is learned to do in that environment doesn't necessarily need reward and punishment. It just needs to be associated with something that we naturally experience, such as hunger, sleep, pain. And so this is going to go into explanations of things why people might develop an anxiety disorder, for example, why people develop phobias. When we get into relationships, we're going to talk about egocentric preferences for people that you're attracted to. And we'll come back to these Pavlovian associative learning processes to really explain those types of activities. Okay. But again, going in our historical line, this is where John B. Watson did his famous experiment with little Albert. I can't remember if this is in this section or not, where he showed that phobias such as fear can be conditioned. And this is going to result in some types of treatment for phobias called exposure therapy. Okay. And in exposure therapy, what you do is you desensitize the person's response to a phobic object. Okay. And we will get into this a little bit further because there's some other interesting disorders that are treated best by exposure therapy, such as post-traumatic stress disorder. You may have read in some newspapers and stuff like that that a lot of military individuals who have PTSD kind of get relief of their symptoms by playing war games on their Xbox or whatever it may be. And that is kind of the idea of exposure therapy. They're exposing themselves to similar trauma, and through that exposure, they're desensitizing themselves to that trauma response. And we will actually see that exposure therapy for PTSD is actually one of the best treatments for PTSD. Um, so kind of an interesting idea, but we'll look at this more as we get through the course, and look at different ways that exposure to and against can affect a person. Okay. And then we'll talk about B.F. Skinner. So B.F. Skinner is known for what's called operant conditioning. So operant meaning that you have to operate or behave in some way, and then you look at the consequences of that behavior. If it's a reward, it increases the probability of that behavior. If it's punished, it decreases the probability of that behavior. So this is that reward punishment idea of how to train, for example, your dog, your cat, your boyfriend, girlfriend, whoever it may be. Um, and when we get to this section, looking at reward and punishment, we will see that in a lot of ways it's kind of an effective method of training, maybe not so much though in a healthy way. So we'll get into that and look at some of the reasons why it works and it doesn't work as we move along. So that's kind of where we're headed with that. And you remember B.F. Skinner is the one that famously wanted to put a child in a box and stated that he could train your child to be a doctor, garbage man, postman, attorney, just by using the rules of reward and punishment. Luckily, he never got to that point, thank goodness. And he's also the one that developed the first guided bomb by training a pigeon to peck at a certain target point that then would fly the bomb with the wing and the tail fins to that position. And again, it was never used in live combat because for some reason there were ethical issues about blowing up a pigeon, but just not thousands of people. But just as a reminder, this is that idea that you can guide behavior through these different mechanisms. Okay. The last person that we'll kind of famously talk about is Albert Bandura. Okay. Because with Albert Bandura, we're going to introduce the idea of how past experience influences current behavior, but not necessarily through reward or punishment. So we're going to start bringing back the mind, decision making, those types of things into the mix of behavior and behavior change. And when we get to Albert Bandura, we'll talk about his famous Bobo doll experiments, which in the most basic form is where a teacher, these Bobo dolls are those who don't know what they are. You can Google them. They're basically kind of balloons that have a weight at the bottom. So when you push it over, it comes back up. Um, and in this experiment, they either had a teacher just gently put up the Bobo doll, or a teacher who kind of violently did hit it with a hammer, as you can see here, throw it in the air, kick it. And then they observed the behavior of the children the next day. And in its most basic form, the children who observed the aggressive teacher was aggressive with it the next day. The students who saw the teacher who was gently putting it up were not as aggressive. But I'm going to leave this as a cliffhanger because that is what's posted on popular media, that just observing aggression creates aggression. But there's more to the Bandura study that we need to discuss because it's not a simple one-to-one occurrence. So, cliffhanger on Albert Bandura. We'll get to him and we'll see the complexities of social learning when we get to that section. The other person that is important to talk about, especially when we get into bringing the mind and cognition back into psychology, is a person named Edward Tolman. Edward Tolman showed that we have something called a cognitive map using rats in a maze. Okay. And just to kind of put this in simple terms, because I think I introduced it a little bit at the beginning of the course, Tolman was famous for, putting a little rat in a wagon, little red wagon, taking it around the maze everywhere. And in thinking about it, the rat is not being rewarded or punished for anything, but he learned that just by taking the rat around a maze, that the rat would learn the maze quicker in order to get food or reward of some type. It didn't need to be rewarded and punished for every wrong or right turn the rat made. Okay. And indeed, on this idea of cognitive maps, we have actually shown that you do have memory receptors in your hypo, no, hippocampus in the limbic system, and you have certain cells for positions in your environment. So there is a cell that fires for your house. There's a cell that fires for when you're getting near your room. There's a cell that fires that guides you from home to work. And they're very specific positional cells that reside within your hippocampus. Okay. And we find that when people get lesions to those areas, such as those with advanced Alzheimer's, that is when they lose their sense of place. They can't remember where they're at, and they can't locate where they need to go in their space or their way of their where they're at. They don't recognize the places that they're at because they lose those certain very specific place cells. Okay, where are we at? Okay, so just to summarize for today, where we're going to head on Tuesday in talking about these different types of learning and learning principles. We're going to start with classical conditioning, which is also known as associative learning. Okay. Associative learning doesn't require your behavior. It doesn't require a reward or punishment. It just requires two things being paired with each other, one of them being a natural response and the other one not. And those associative ties are made. Okay. The second type of learning that we will go over this coming Tuesday is operant conditioning. The word operant meaning that you have to behave in some way. So this one we have a stimulus and we want to put a behavior, and then we put consequences. So consequences is reward or punishment. Put a C for consequences, and that determines then what happens next time we interact with that stimulus. Okay. Um, and so this is again stimulus response. This is stimulus behavior consequence response. Okay. And then social learning, and I want to just emphasize this point at this time, is that social learning is kind of a unique human behavior. Okay. We don't see this in very many other species. Some primates, dolphins, elephants, this has been observed in, but pretty much other species that we observe do what's called imitative learning. Okay. Meaning, so the little, let's say the little coyote um, isn't necessarily learning from mom how to seek its prey. It imitates mom's behavior in order to obtain the neural knowledge to go seek out that prey. Okay. Social learning is different. Social learning is, um, best example I could give is cooking something. Okay. Let's say you go observe mom cooking spaghetti, dad cooking spaghetti, grandma cooking spaghetti, um, and sister cooking spaghetti. Okay. You may choose your preference and go with mom, or because of you're a social learner, you might combine all four ways of cooking that spaghetti to come up with your own unique way of cooking spaghetti. Okay. If you need to figure out a problem, you may go watch 5 or 6 YouTube videos and then determine how you're going to go about solving that problem. Okay. So it's the ability to take in information from different social aspects, combining that information and making a unique behavior of your own. All right. And it is this process that many evolutionary psychologists and sociologists believe why humans have become so adaptive to our environments, and the reason why human beings basically have adapted to almost every environment in the world, albeit not a lot of the ocean or the colder regions of the world, but pretty much every environment that is inhabitable humans have found a way to inhabit it. And a lot of evolutionarists believe it's because of this social learning ability that humans have. Okay. And then we will finish this section off on Tuesday talking about these three things that occur in all three types of learning. Generalization is the idea that when we learn something, we tend to generalize it to all things. That so little Albert, if you remember, didn't only become fearful of little white rats, he became fearful of everything white and fluffy. A lot of one of the things I mentioned, that I worked in the field of relationship violence and domestic violence. A lot of survivors of relationship violence come to assume, I'm just saying this because the majority I worked with were women. They came to assume that all men were abusive after years of abuse and learning abuse. And so they generalize to the whole population of men that they're this way. And you could probably see this in all the categorizations that we do. Okay. But this is an example of generalization. And then discrimination is our ability to tell the difference between two similar stimuli that have different outcomes. Okay. So, for example, you might have a friends, you define them as friends, but one friend you don't like spending a lot of time with, and the other friend you do, but maybe they like spending a lot of time with each other. So they don't see the things that you see in the difference between your friendships. I don't know if that's a clear example, but it's that ability to discriminate between two similar stimuli, kind of the opposite of generalization. And then we'll talk about spontaneous recovery. Again, this is when we haven't interacted with a stimulus for a while and we come across it and we act in the same way that we learned about it. And I think I've mentioned this in this class. I liken this to when I'm being a professor versus going home up in Idaho around my family because I'm the youngest in my family and all of those things. And my wife will actually notice the difference between Professor Curtis, serious, adult-like, I hope, all of those things. And then we go visit the family. I act more like a little brother. I don't act not in the most intelligent ways because that's just not how the behavior works in that area. And that's that idea of spontaneous recovery of behaviors that you've learned in different contexts that you haven't interacted with a lot. Okay, so that is where we're headed. Um, and we'll get much more detail this coming Monday, but I do want to stop for right now. We're a little bit early, but that's okay. It's Thursday. And I just want to ask, does anybody have any questions on where we're headed for the first for the learning versus memory, and then specifically on the different types of learning and where we're kind of heading in understanding this? You could put your question in the chat. You can unmute yourself. Um,
No questions.
Thank you, Angel. Thank you, Tion. Hey. Okay. All right. Thank you, Jalen. Yes, Rochelle, they will. But the next quiz won't be till after fall break. All right. Hearing no more, let's go ahead and get out of here for today. Thank you for coming, class. It was good to see you all here on this Thursday. Please take care of yourself, and we'll continue this conversation in more detail this coming Tuesday. Take care, everyone.